Hello and welcome to the Tonearm, where we connect you with the people and ideas moving culture forward. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today we're putting the Tonearm's needle on bassist and composer Linda Mae Han-Oh. Linda's a Grammy winner who's recorded with Pat Metheny, Kenny Barron, and Joe Lovano, amongst many, many others. She was even the model for the bassist character in Pixar's animated film Soul. But it's her own work that brought us together today. Her latest album, Strange Heavens, explores why we choose familiar hells over strange heavens, why we stick with what we know even when change might save us. It's a question that cuts through everything from personal relationships to political choices. Linda approaches her albums like journals, each one capturing where she is as an artist and as a person. Since becoming a mother, she says her music has gotten more direct, more distilled, and less about ego, more about emotional truth. She's here to talk about that creative honesty, her work with the New Standards Project promoting women composers in jazz, and why making music with emotional directness matters more than ever. I bring you Linda Mae Han-Oh. I would like to start by asking you about perhaps the moment or the experience that sort of sparked for you the concept of using the human tendency to choose a familiar hell over strange heavens as an organizing principle for this record.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what was the moment that struck me to do that. I've always heard similar sayings such as that and had many conversations about topics like that. I think a lot of the music that I was writing was around the time of election time. So there were a lot of thoughts about the decisions we make when we deciding who we want in power and what those decisions entail and what we as human beings are comfortable with. And I think when I think of that phrase that we often choose a familiar hell, that can pertain to our everyday lives, everyday relationships with people, to bigger picture issues such as having health care for everybody or not, or when it comes to changing gun laws. In many ways, I just think sometimes change is hard. Change is hard. I wanted to use that as the guiding principle just to make us think a little bit about what our familiar hell looks like and what could be that strange heaven. I think it's good to ask yourself those questions, whether that be in a micro setting of your own community, your own day-to-day lives, to a macro setting.
Something else that I'm curious about as it relates to that construct and how it goes on to manifest in the title of the album. There's two things I wanted to ask you about that. One has to do with the actual compositions that make up the album, how themes and philosophy and notions like that make their way and manifest in your compositions.
Mhm.
And the other I wanted to ask you about was, and this one's still maybe a little more fun, but
Mhm.
there's a little bit of an ironic sense to this because it's a bit of a looking back for you in terms of the chordless trio format, working with Ambrose. And I wonder how for you as an artist and a creative being, you can make sure this is a strange heaven and not a familiar hell when you're revisiting people and formats you've worked in before.
Yeah, I think, I tend to think about the whole, is it the Heraclides philosophy of like, you'll never really enter the same river twice. It'll always be different, So I think there's a bit of that it just kind of is what it is. Time has changed us all in many ways. A lot has happened since 2008, 2009, when we were recording that record and playing some of that material. So inevitably things are going to be different. And I think for me, it is more of a statement of where are we now? Like, for example, the first album, the title of it is Entry. And the idea was that it's a journal entry of where I am now. And it's also my entry into the world in the sense that it was my first album as a leader.
Ah.
So I think when we release music, or at least when I release music, when I put music out there, for me, it's more about saying, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm thinking about, this is what I'm doing with my peers, and this is what I'm interested in. So I'm not so concerned with whether or not is it just as good or better, than what I've done in the past. What is that? I hope that people can hear and feel that I'm growing. Certainly feel that way as a musician, that I've grown a lot and I'm a lot more mature and comfortable in my own skin.
Hmm.
But, it is what it is, and I love documenting that. And that's why I love recording and putting music and work out there.
How about in terms of the compositions?
Mm.
Something I was looking forward to talking with you about, or something that was specific about me wanting to speak with you, is I often talk about things like titles with artists, especially instrumental and creative music artists,
Mm.
to understand how the titles and the themes they may or may not express relate to the music. As you might imagine, I get a range of, there's as many answers as there are artists. I always get a special laugh when an artist is kind of dismissive and says, "Oh, I don't really, the producer named him," or "I didn't care." Yeah, I love that. But what I also love, and what I was excited to talk to you about, is you seem to be a little bit on the other end of that, that there is meaning and intention
Mm.
throughout the entire course of a project, if you will. And so I think that's why I would ask you about how the themes that we've talked about so far in this conversation, how do they manifest in the music? Like, what role are they playing during the compositional process? Do you sit with a philosophy or a thought and manifest that, or at the sake of asking you to dissect your process a little bit?
Yeah. So, one thing that's changed for me in the past several years is that I focus more on the experience of composition than necessarily the nuts and bolts or the ingredients that go into it.
Mm,
And one thing that's really changed my perspective of how I write music is really visualizing what I want to feel if I were sitting front row in my own concert, you know? And I think about that, like if I were sitting and watching this particular group, what is it that I want to feel, and what is it that I want to hear but feel? What's the energy that I want to bring home from that particular moment? And I think a lot about that. Well, that helps me, first of all, compose and construct those elements that are going to help me feel that way. So I actually imagine, if I were sitting front row at the Vanguard, what is the first song? What do I want to hear, see, or feel, from the composition? And with that, I think comes the emotional element and how that's going to be conveyed through the music. So, and I love that process because it really makes me think about what the experience is that I want to have, and not what anybody else wants to have, because you're going to go crazy trying to imagine what everyone else wants to experience and feel, and how they're going to interpret the music and the emotions. And everybody's going to be different, and not everyone's going to like what you do or interpret it the same way. So I think about how I'm going to interpret that and what do I want to feel, and actually visualize and pretend I am there to hear the music. So if I'm sensing a certain feeling, for example, a feeling of catharsis or something, I think about, okay, what does that mean to me if I'm sitting front row, and what do I want to hear from that? And from there, it can start with a cymbal sound, it can start with a specific chord, it can start with a melody, it can start with a pitch, it can start with a tempo. And that just opens everything up for me and makes me feel like I have any sort of obligations when it comes to creating or writing music. It's just about the present moment and the experience that I want to take away from that particular piece of music.
that's really beautiful. As you were speaking, I was thinking about how exciting and fun and potentially fulfilling it must be when you're thinking about the musicians who you're going to actually have as you're putting together an ensemble or a project. And the idea that, in a way, you're thinking about what you want to hear that musician play. And you're sort of, yeah, it's really beautiful. If I could assemble some of my favorite players and choose what they all did together, that's a wonderful life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fun also just to use your imagination.
Well, that's interesting. Does that imply that there's a certain fun for you, or a certain aspect of this where you might enjoy putting people in different situations than we might expect finding them in?
Yeah, I guess so. I think. I'm lucky to be working with improvising musicians who have navigated so many different spaces and different settings and are comfortable with uncertainty, and I think it's always fun to explore what that uncertainty is. But I often find that with experienced improvising musicians, it's a fun exploration when we're playing in the moment.
I saw elsewhere you spoke about the fact that since your son was born, you've had what I think I'm going to paraphrase as a certain sharpening of your sense of responsibility. I love that phrase, but I'm curious, what does that sharpening mean in the context of the music you make?
Mm. I think in many ways it changes some of the messages that I have in the music, changes how I create the music in the sense that I feel somewhat a distillation of the message and the emotion that I want to get through. I think in my particular opinion about my own music, I feel like the essence or the DNA of what I'm trying to get across is a lot more direct than perhaps in the past.
Mm.
I'm not sure how or why. I think part of it is thinking about the experience and rather than the obligation of what to write, what to compose, and why. And it's more about that direct experience and emotional experience. But I would have to say a lot comes down to my purpose. I think when you have a child, just thinking about what is my purpose and what do I want to do with this music. And I think a lot becomes less about the ego, but more about what the direct contact with the emotional content, I think.
While we're on the topic of direct experience, I wonder if you might be able to tell me the story behind Living Proof,
Hmm.
which I understand was inspired by your mom's story.
Yeah. So, I mean, Living Proof is inspired by so many people around me who have just overcome odds. And I think about that a lot. It's what drives me a lot in what I do day to day. And my mom's particular story, she's from Kuala Lumpur, the city in capital of Malaysia. She left school at a young age. She has a fourth grade education, roughly about there, had many siblings. Her mother was also a very tenacious woman who we don't know where she comes from. She was essentially taken from the south of China and brought to Malaysia. It's unclear as to how. My mother doesn't like to talk about it, but my father has implied that she was essentially taken from her family, but somehow raised and by people that we don't know. So we can't really trace back what her lineage is. She had a tough life. She sold noodles on the street, doing various jobs. She was widowed 3 times. I always forget exactly how many siblings they have, but it was, at a very turbulent time where they couldn't quite afford to keep all of their children. And so my mother went to work quite young. She was about 10 or 11 when she went to work for a family, helping out with day-to-day chores and looking after, sort of being an au pair to some younger kids. Meanwhile, also teaching herself how to read and write Chinese by working at a printing press. And by the time she was 19, she learned how to sew. And by the time she was 20, she started her own sewing school called BB's Sewing School in Kuala Lumpur, where she taught other young women how to sew and make a living. So she was a seamstress and made beautiful dresses. And She's a person to me that has overcome many odds and is probably the most hardworking person that I know. And when we moved to Australia, it wasn't the easiest thing to maintain being a seamstress. At that time, the beginning of a lot of fast fashion, and so she ended up working as a sewing machinist for a hospital goods store, so hospital goods company. So myself and my sisters, we would all help pack arm slings and cushion covers. And she's been doing that work ever since. So she's an example of somebody who has really overcome the odds. And I'm constantly inspired by so many people around me. My in-laws they're from Cuba, and they came to the US in the 90s, crossed the border from Mexico to Texas in their 40s with 2 kids with nothing but $50, and somehow have managed to raise his 2 kids, college-educated kids, and buy a house. And I know it's different times where that was maybe more possible than it is now, but I'm constantly inspired by these stories. I was just on the road with Lionel Lueke a few months ago, and I was actually just listening to the recording, and just he's got an amazing story of starting guitar quite late in Benin, going to study music in Côte d'Ivoire, sleeping on the street because he had nowhere to sleep. And before he slept on the street, he would sleep under the pianos until they discovered that he was doing that. And then he had to sleep on the street. And he remembers when somebody stole his shoes. And now he's playing with Herbie Hancock. I'm in awe of humanity sometimes, of how tenacity can overcome odds.
Is that what the proof is? It's proof that there's something better. It's proof that things can be overcome.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's extremely inspiring. And I feel lucky to know these people, to breathe the same air as these people.
I know it's actually it's very astounding to hear you speak of those things, but also the lineage of resilient women. We're not talking about distant past. We're talking about very, immediate lineage. And I'm curious, it does beg the question of what of their resourcefulness and resilience do you see in yourself, especially as someone who you didn't exactly choose the easiest career path. You've made your mark at such a relatively young age. And, how do you see yourself in the context of those women and the other people that have inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel a bit of an obligation, that this is what my mother has gone through. This is what my grandmother has gone through for me to be where I am. So there's a bit of that obligation that that inspires me to work. What a privilege it is for me not to be selling noodles on the street and to be studying music and playing music for a living. So that's also a way to inspire me to work, to keep on working, to inspire other people to do the same. And so that constant reminder of that privilege, I think, is something that keeps me going, and I do feel that obligation to rise up and to carry that torch in many ways.
I would love to take some of these themes of responsibility and growth and development and even freedom and take them in a slightly different direction, bring them back to the music if I can.
Mm.
Again, to badly paraphrase you, you've talked about the freedom and responsibility that you say the chordless trio brings: freedom in playing, responsibility to storytelling, musical storytelling. Could you unpack that a little bit for me? I'm so curious about the freedom part. Seems more obvious when we talk about improvised music and such, but the responsibility, it's such a specific word.
So you've got these 3 voices, 3 separate people. But when we've got a composition with a melody, with harmony, with rhythmic elements to get across, as far as the responsibility, what I would say is that I guess in a nutshell, with freedom comes responsibility, because there is the melody, there is the general structure of the composition, especially with Tyshawn and Ambrose. It's not always known exactly what's going to happen at any time. And so with the freedom for somebody to take on the melody, it may not always be Ambrose's job to do that. At any moment, it could be my job to do that. At any moment, it could be my job to really outline the harmony quite explicitly. And again, so these jobs, I think, are not clearly assigned either. They're all decisions that we have to make in that moment. So with that responsibility means that I'm not just allotted that bass part, I'm allotted the whole composition as a playground in many ways to explore. And it is my responsibility to uphold if I see to jump on any part of that playground. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so and I think also with a smaller group and who's taking on the role of marking certain areas and roadmaps. I mean, I always feel that everybody should have that responsibility, but I think when we have a more sparse setting where there are no chords, quite often sections where we can take it many different ways. There's a responsibility to be aware of the energy that is happening at any given moment to make the decision whether or not to outline certain sections or move things forward. And that's what I mean by freedom. With freedom comes responsibility, because I really do believe that those decisions that improvising musicians make to change a section, to cue a certain phrase, to bring us back to this theme or to play this theme, to me, the most effective way to do those things relies on being in the moment and reading the energy that is going on. So there's the responsibility to uphold the composition, but then also the responsibility to be in the moment and to read the energy and see how, as a band, we're going to take that energy and go.
The Tonearm will be right back after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonearm.com, our online journal covering unexpected music and culture. This week on The Tonearm, British dub legend Adrian Sherwood teaches us how to play the mixing desk like an instrument. Zach Little from indie roots band Saint Seneca explains how the songs on his new album mirror the cycle of a planetary system. Experimental composer Leah Bertucci describes how her work exposes clarity as a luxury in a world of misinformation. And hand-to-earth trumpeter Peter Knight discusses how the Aboriginal concept of Raki underpins his quintet's practice. You'll find all this and more on The Tonearm. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter. That's thetonearm.com. The Tonearm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to The Tonearm. When I was thinking about that question and asking it of you, I was thinking that perhaps it implied to not play out for the sake of playing out, you
Yep.
know, but then hearing you articulate what it means to you, what I also hear is that if one of the players in any given moment accepts the responsibility of cueing the change or holding the rhythm, whatever the role that they take, it allows more freedom to the other two.
Absolutely.
It's a wonderful sort of articulation of the interplay that's allowed to happen when everyone is looking for a chance to have freedom, express freedom, but is willing to be responsible to the others as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great point, playing out for the sake of playing out. I mean, that to me ties into the idea of energy, and what is the energy of the group? How do we read the energy? And playing out for the sake of playing out isn't necessarily reading the energy unless the energy feels like that is probably a good way to go. And I think playing out for the sake of playing out, then it begs the question of like, how are we being responsible for the melody and the harmony at that time? And that relates to the decisions of what the responsibility, whether or not we're going to maintain that responsibility to uphold the integrity of the composition or take it in a different direction. You really have to ask yourself that question. If you're gonna play out for the sake of playing out, what is the intent behind that?
Yeah, you actually anticipated the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that the responsibility to the composition and where, like, what's the depth or the length of that responsibility? When do you get to set that aside? And I guess in the case of some of this music, the composition tells you when it's okay to do a certain thing. But other times, as you said, you have to be prepared to respond to the energy too, and maybe deviate. It's all so fascinating.
Yeah.
But you spoke also about the three people, and I think you may have said, when there's only three or when there's no chorded instrument. When I was reading about the Glass House, there was this idea that you sort of deliberately constructed the arrangements to almost amplify or or expand the sound of what the 5 people involved could do, if I understand that correctly.
Mm.
Now I'm curious, what do you get to explore differently with this trio?
Yeah, well, there are elements, I think, with this trio that I still have a certain compositional elements that hold sort of true in the trio, in the sense that I'm trying to cover multiple parts. But in terms of what's different about this trio is that because there's less people, there are more possibilities in my mind of the places that we can go, in the sense that you don't have to make a decision and hope that the other 4 people are going to go with you, and on top of that, Ambrose and Tyshawn are just such incredible listeners, such detailed listeners, that I do anything and they're on it, and their reaction times are so quick. I really think that also allows for even more possibilities.
Clearly, this record and these pieces are well served your sort of extensive working relationship with Tyshawn. And for our listeners who don't know, you performed together quite extensively with Vijay Iyer. Could you talk a little bit about what are you, because of that working relationship, and I'm assuming the professional and personal relationship that evolves from that, what does that allow the 2 of you to access together that might be different than another pairing?
Yeah. So for anyone that doesn't know, I mean, Tyshawn is just such a unique human being. He is such an incredible human being. In the same sentence that he can tell you about Max Roach, he can also talk about Schoenberg or Charles Ives, or he is such an in-depth musician. He's got crazy perfect pitch to the cent.
Wow.
He's also, I mentioned the response time with both Ambrose and Tyshawn. His response time is so quick, but on top of that, his ability to grasp music and form and the logic of the composition is extremely quick. He internalizes everything very quickly, even some of the most complex patterns, and coordinating different patterns when we play with some of Vijay's compositions. It's various time signatures over each other, and Tyshawn is just devouring it, and it doesn't take him long at all to get to that point. So when you're playing with somebody that is so quick to digest music, it gets to the essence of the energy and the moment and the fun of the improvisational part. So he's extremely inspiring when it comes to seeing him devour that music and digest it and internalize it so quickly. But then the level of what's happening within the improvisation, it's like, because that part is easy for him, it's straight off to the races, in my opinion. And he's so sensitive to every single change within the group, whether it be with Vijay's group or in this trio. And also, Tyshawn is always going to go for something different in that moment. He's a ferocious force when it comes to the technical elements of the music, but he's also extremely emotional when it comes to bringing that to the audience. I love playing with someone with those extremes of dynamics, of ability, of how to explore the music.
Your inclusion of a composition from Jerry Allen and one from Melba Liston seems like a very sort of practical, real world, yet still artistic manifestation of your work with the Institute for Jazz and Gender Studies at Berkeley.
Mhm.
I've talked to Chris Davis, some other people that are either affiliated with or admirers of the program and the work there. And I'm curious, could you tell me a little bit about the importance of that work to you? And specifically what the New Standards Project means to you, because it's such a simple yet beautiful solution, if you will, or idea. I've been taken with it since I first learned about it. It's just such a brilliant idea. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so I'm proud to have been a part of the whole New Standards Project. For those who don't know, a lot of jazz education relies on a textbook, a book of compositions called The Real Book, and it comes in many volumes. There are hundreds and hundreds of these compositions that a lot of jazz students and adults and professionals use to perform and to learn songs. It's not my preferred way to learn songs. Ask any jazz musician about it, and they will know about it. The decades that it has been around, these volumes of compositions have only featured a handful of women. And that was something that Terry brought to light. So she decided to release the New Standards book, which are compositions written by women, but also from various generations, including Melba Liston and the song Just Waiting, up-and-coming musicians who are just starting out and starting to put some music out there, who some of whom have not released their first albums yet. So it's quite intergenerational. There's quite a diverse range of the styles. They're musicians from all over the world. So I'm extremely proud to have been a part of that. And I'm in awe of Terry Lynn Carrington and everything that she does as a performing musician and an educator and a visionary who is really trying to change the environment of the music scene, the improvising music scene. And she's someone that if she sees that something needs to be changed, she makes the steps to actually do it. Yeah, I'm very proud to be a part of the Institute and to have been a part of the New Standards Project. And I'm excited to see what more will come of it.
Is the idea with the new standards that it is a living, breathing corpus the way the real books are?
I think so. I mean, as of now, that's just volume 1. So I anticipate there'll be other volumes. Like the real book, you've genres or styles within the real book. And you see as it progresses, what else is in there, as time progresses. So I think so. I haven't quite spoken to Terry about the next volumes, but I'm pretty sure she's thinking about that.
While we're on the topic of compositions, I'd like to ask you maybe about a couple of further ones on the record. Can you tell me about the relationship between a cappella and Joni Mitchell's The Fiddle and the Drum?
Yeah. So I wrote a cappella around the time of the election, and particularly after the election, we were listening a lot to Joni Mitchell's Fiddle and the Drum at home. It was sort of our source of solace for my husband and I. And my son just absolutely adores Joni Mitchell. Ever since he was a newborn, we would play both the live Travels, the album Travels. And that was what he would go to sleep to when he was born. And so he's been listening to Joni Mitchell since he was alive, basically. This was a song that he really loved. And he kept asking for Joni Mitchell a cappella, Joni Mitchell a cappella. I mean, it's such an incredible composition, The Fiddle and the Drum. And the lyrics, the conviction and the vulnerability of just the voice. It's such a touching and tear-jerking to me song that just hits me right in the heart, right to the core. And I was really inspired by that. And I wanted something on the album to have some sort of similar emotion, maybe a little bit more in the cathartic sense, because I do see a cappella as being a little bit mournful, but I wanted there to be a twinge of hope in there. So that was my inspiration for that. It was more the emotional content, trying to think of that direct feeling and that vulnerability. For me, it's a similar feeling of what if I was sitting front row in that seat. I want this experience. I want this feeling, not necessarily exactly the same as what the Fiddle and the Drum has, but something that could have a similar energy.
I get it now.
Mhm.
And tell me about Portal. I think that the sort of commentary or the attempt to address what I think we could all understand, the shorthand around what our technology and our devices and our social media has done. And you talk about the election. And when you mentioned 2008 earlier, what came into my head was how that was a lifetime ago. And it was a different universe. I mean, not even a different world, a different universe governed by what seemed like different rules. I'm curious,
Absolutely.
I have to make an assumption to ask this question. So please feel free to pull away even the base assumption behind the question. But I would think that as someone who does the kind of work you do, and I think of it as almost having a small business person aspect to it, right? Like you are very much in charge of your career, right? Whether you have people around you who help and help you with certain specialized work or not. How do you protect yourself and that, however you describe the space you need to be in to be creative, whether it's contemplative or quiet or whatever, how do you protect your sort of psychic and creative space when you have to actually use these platforms as part of your career?
Absolutely. Something I'm still figuring out. Everyone in the business, you're constantly getting messages from promoters and agents, we need to plug this gig, we need to do this. And I somewhat envy some of the people that I know who are quite savvy with social media and quite good with that part of that business part of things, because it's something that is really does not come natural to me. It's still something that I think a lot of musicians, a lot of artists are figuring out, especially of my generation. Maybe the younger ones are a lot more savvy. But for me, it's just about preserving my own artistic integrity and doing what's necessary and spending as little time as I need to on that front. I'm quite good friends with wonderful vocalist Michael Mayo, who's very good at we've spoken about this, about the social media aspect. And I think it was great to hear him speak about just the idea of creating, the emphasis on creating art. And if you want to put it out there, great, and not reading your self-worth through what is put out there. And I've had many conversations with students and up and coming musicians about that, how to stay healthy, how to maintain your artistic integrity. And I think so much of it boils down to having a good community and a good support base. And I think what's beautiful about the work that we do is that it's so nice that we can have those hours creating music, rehearsing music, listening to music without having to have a device. I don't take that for granted. Yeah, I think that's ultimately what it comes down to is your community and your support base. And knowing that also there's a certain degree that it's not reality, what's on your device and that whole virtual world. It is not the be all and end all.
It's interesting too that, you're in a field where you don't have to, it's not the primary part of your job. There's so many people who they're at the machine all day because it's what they, it's just part of their gig. When you're actually doing your primary job, it's actually a requirement for you to not be at the device and to be present somewhere else. And that to me is,
Absolutely,
it's quite a luxury in 2025.
Absolutely. And I count myself so lucky. We get to travel and meet people from all different places and have those connections. And not everybody gets that privilege.
Yeah. There's so much intention behind your music, and there's so much intention and emotional content in this album, whether it's finding hope and inspiration or confronting anxieties about the world we're leaving and creating for our children. And I wonder, maybe a slightly smaller question, but I'm curious to how it lands for you. As your own son starts to get a little bit older, what would you like him to understand about the music you make and sort of the role that being a creative being plays in your life? Assuming that there'll be different points when I was going to ask you when he's old enough to ask, but there's no such thing. Children they always surprise us. He may start asking at preschool age and ask again every year, who knows? But I'm curious, instilling sort of the value of a life of creativity is sort of what I'm getting at.
Mm. What do I hope that he will bring from the music?
Yeah, what would you hope he comes to understand? Like my father was a policeman. And so I learned certain things about his worldview and his values, not everything, but certain things. I would have learned something completely different about him had he been a bass player and a
Yeah,
composer.
absolutely.
And so I wonder what insight you hope this will instill for, your son. What would you like your child or someday children to understand about you?
Yeah, so I think I would have to say two main things. The first one is the importance of community. I think he's likely going to be an only child, and I want him to experience this wider community of musicians, of artists, and watch how we come together, whether it be to hang out and talk about music, or just hang out and play music. And one thing I'm proud of, he's only 4 years old, but he has met so many musicians and seen us in so many different situations with other musicians, and just the wider community, and knowing that there's a strong community. We don't all have to live in the same place. We don't always have to come from the same backgrounds, and the value of community. And then on top of that, I would say the value of imagination. So we talk about it a lot, and he inspires me so much when it comes to imagination, of just envisaging what is possible, what can we create together, how can we create a connection together and strive for better.
Thank you so much, Linda May Hanno, and thank you for listening to The Tonearm. If you enjoyed this conversation, I bet you'll like at least one more of the nearly 300 episodes available in our free archive at thetonearm.com. The Tonearm is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant, and our theme music is by Birdie, spelled B-U-R-D-Y. The single best way you can support us is by sharing us with at least one friend. I hope you'll do that today. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.